Thanks very much, Tim. When Tim first asked me to come and do this talk, my first thought was, oh, it's like bringing coals back to Newcastle, because there is so much drinking that goes on in this city, and also there's been so much very good research on the topic, particularly with Robert Holland's, whose 1995 study was, I think, groundbreaking, and then the work he did with Paul Chatterton. And I'd heartily recommend reading those books if you get a chance to do so. And since then, we've had numerous papers, and I know there are a lot of PhD students and early career researchers who are, again, producing some very interesting work based on observations in this city. This is a public lecture, so word of warning, this is going to be a bit of a theory-free zone. I'm rather pleased to do it, so I don't have to worry about the correct theoretical terminologies, and I'm pitching it at a more general level. I've been studying alcohol, drinking and planning in its broadest sense for over a decade, and the talk will be based on three outputs from that body of research and various other projects that have done. Tim's just talked about our most recent project, which was comparing the drinking habits, cultures of groups of young people in the southeast and the northeast. We looked at 18 to 24-year-olds and 15 to 16-year-olds. And prior to that, with a colleague, Adam Eldridge, I did quite a lot of focus group research and other research, as Tim said, as a basis for the Purple Flag benchmarking scheme. We've recently published academic papers from the JRF project, but some of the policy recommendations are still developing. I haven't actually chaired that West End partnership yet. The first meeting is in 2 weeks' time. And I'll be talking a bit more about some of the ideas that might flow from the project later in the lecture. Well, people often ask me, because I trained as an architect, how on earth have you ended up researching alcohol? You know, what is the connection? And I think one way of looking at it is to say that urban design and planning is partly, I mean, it's not totally, but it's partly about how we arrange encounters between ourselves as human beings in buildings and in public spaces. And it's about the quality of those encounters, how often they happen or not. And much of the recent research has shown that alcohol is a kind of social glue, a lubricant, if you like, that can have either an easing or an explosive impact, and definitely has an impact on the quality and atmosphere of those encounters. So I think that's the relationship. And it's also another factor in the way in which urban design and planning are less talked about rather than crime or health or so on in terms of alcohol policy. But I think actually they are important to it. So the issues around the topic of alcohol consumption, drinking habits, have been more deeply researched. They've broadened since 2000, when much of the early research was done. But actually, many of the practical issues are the same. And so rather than starting with the usual commentary about Vikings and going back to the history in Hogarth and Gin Lane, I'm going to start with where we are now and look at some of the issues around health, pricing and licensing, and then move on to urban design and planning. It's a common point that's made by many researchers, but more especially, most recently by Jill Valentine and her team, that while much of public policy is directed towards what happens on the street and in bars and clubs, actually the majority of alcohol consumption happens in the home. And as this ICM poll, which was commissioned by DrinkAware, the charity, shows, many of us, particularly those of us who are older, tend to use alcohol as a way of relaxing and unwinding after a stressful day at work. And nothing wrong, you might think, with that, you might think, but there are some issues around that. In particular, we don't tend to measure what we drink in the home. I mean, there's not much hard evidence about this, but we'll come on to that a bit later. But certainly, there's nobody measuring the quantity of whiskey we put in a glass, the amount we pour into a glass of wine, or how many cans we take from the fridge. And the home is also the place at which most young people learn to drink. In our research, we found that young people were generally having their first drink with their parents at a family celebration, often at the age of 13 or so, sometimes even younger at the age of 11. And you have to take into account here that the medical advice is that drinking below the age of 15 is injurious to health. And what we found is that many of the young people who drink also go, and here we have the figure from one research project, that 72% of 15 and 16-year-olds report drinking alcohol at least once a month. Is that that another study found that nearly a third of 15-year-olds reported drinking outside. And there's a tremendous amount of attention focused on this, and almost a kind of moral panic, a kind of concern about antisocial behaviour in public spaces. And what we suggest is that perhaps there's too much of an emphasis placed on this. Yes, we did find that some of the young people we interviewed did have one or two really scary incidents with drinking too much in public places, in a park, say, and maybe being left on their own or being involved in violence. But for the majority, it was not a huge problem. And in any case, many of them didn't drink at all, as this latest study by Rachel Herring shows. So what we also started to think about was, well, if young people aren't drinking in parks or are discouraged from drinking in parks, where do we drink? And traditionally, of course, most drinking used to go on in pubs, and pubs are being described as third places between home and work. There were so many of them that they would become a kind of home from home for some people. But we have to be careful not to romanticize them. They are, of course, male-dominated. They were very much male-dominated. I can remember in the 1970s it being a very big thing as a feminist, and I see Rose nodding here, to go into a pub and order a glass of beer on my own, and that being quite a frightening prospect. But nevertheless, they are places where sociality does take place. And there have been a number of studies by the Camera, by the Social SRIC Institute in Oxford, and they do find that not only do people go there for a chat, but there's also an ambience in many pubs that you can talk to strangers. So in effect, they act as a place that supports connection and social sustainability, and therefore mental health. But pubs are not allowed anymore to have young people drinking in them. And one of the things that we found in our research project was that the latest enforcement orders that prevent underage drinkers going into pubs, those below the age of 18, it's being very strictly enforced. And this aspect of the legislation is actually beginning to work rather well. And licensees are very worried about losing their license if they serve anybody who's underage. And it may be that some of you in the audience do have some experience with that. And there's also some evidence, again from Valentine, about pubs in rural areas, about the kind of intergenerational controls that you get in pubs, whereby an older generation would moderate excessive consumption, or maybe report back to somebody's parents if they'd been seen drinking too much or making trouble. So now pubs are out of bounds for under 18-year-olds. So where can they go? Well, what they might do if they had enough money, and in fact we just went to a tea place around the corner and found it fairly full, was to go to one of the new tea or coffee outlets that nobody predicted in the 1980s would expand in the way that they have. And the figures are quite staggering. 3,000 coffee outlets in the UK. Costa Coffee has 27% growth since 2011. And the success of the 4 big coffee chains has been such that now Tesco's are launching their own brand, which have a cunning decor which lead you into thinking that perhaps you're in some hip west coast of America kind of freewheeling coffee place, but no, it's owned by a corporate conglomerate. And I dare say they will become, this own brands all over the place. In our earlier research in the mid-noughties, 2005 and 6, we did go and interview some of the big chains of coffee providers. And one of the things that we were puzzled about was why that they didn't open later. One prominent alcohol researcher, Phil Hadfield, has commented that it's absolutely impossible to buy a coffee in an English town or city centre after 9 o'clock at night. I mean, that's changing. It's not quite as true as it was, but nevertheless, most of the big chains close at about 5 or 6. And the answer they gave us was that the footfall just wasn't sufficient. But one does wonder, if there's large footfall in town and city centres, why isn't it that tea and coffee places aren't opening later? What we found also in that early research was that although there's an idea about going out, about encouraging people to go out in town and city centres, and government policy often includes that kind of exhortation. I was fortunate to serve on a select committee in 2003 on the evening economy, and one of the recommendations it made was about trying to get museums and galleries to stay open later and to encourage a more lively town and city centre with these types of activities. But work by Andrew Tallon down in Cardiff and our own focus group research found that really there's actually very little appetite for this kind of high cultural activity. And all the Mintel reports and studies show that it's higher income groups, it's older age groups who tend to like to go out to the theatre, to the opera, to go out to galleries, what the bulk of ordinary people like doing is going out and eating and drinking and having different styles and ways of doing so. And so we've seen an expansion in what David Bell calls drink-attainment in town and city centres. Or he also talks about the hospitable city. I mean, this has been much criticised in terms of gentrification, domestication by the Cappuccino Society, but nevertheless, we've seen this absolute expansion in the numbers of restaurants and cafes since 2000 and with the regeneration activities. And there was a fear when the banking crisis hit in 2008 that this expansion would stall and just would not continue, and that there would be a tremendous bankruptcy across the sector. Interestingly, it hasn't happened. And the figure on the slide, I don't know if we can dim the lights a little bit to make the slides easier to see. It says that 42% of respondents to a Mintel, that's a market research company poll, survey report, reported eating out at least once a month. And what seems to have happened is that in the recession, people tend to eat out less and maybe go to more down market restaurants, but nevertheless, they still are going out. And this passion for eating out has affected the drinks industry, so that we see that many pubs have turned into gastropubs, which are virtually restaurants. And Wetherspoons, which is one of the fastest growing pub chains, or has been in the UK, now has a greater volume of sales from its food offer than it has from its drinks offer. Well, moving on, Newcastle is, of course, famous for being a party town. Sorry, I can't do the accent at all. As is Brighton, as are other cities across the world, and even parts of the West End of London. And probably what I'm saying is the phrase teaching, telling my grandmother to suck eggs. I'm sure you guys know about it, but to us older researchers, what we were doing was finding out what happened when young people, in our research, what happened when young people went out at night. Because a lot of the discussion about youth cultures and drinking doesn't really take into account what people actually do. So what we found was that there was this pattern in the northeast and in the southeast of, we say young people, but also in the northeast, I think what we're also seeing is a greater inclusivity, as with the anecdote about trying to get us into a nightclub. Whereas in the southeast, it was a bit more age segregated, but of a certain kind of ritual to going out that was a fluid ritual, but nevertheless a pattern. And it was always included people going out in groups, of meeting up to begin with, and following a pattern of going from bar to bar, finally ending up in a club or a casino, fast food, taxi home, maybe a sleepover. And this is not something that's unusual to Newcastle or Liverpool. It's true, I would say, probably pretty well across the UK, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's absolutely a similar pattern in Europe. And of course, this is the behaviour which causes most concern to policymakers. And the argument, many of the arguments have been about the pattern of going out, about being, the phrase determined drunkenness was coined at one point by Fiona Measham. And the attitude in policy terms is it's about getting tanked up soddled, you know, all the other terminology, hammered, mortal, etc., etc. And our argument was, and those of a sort of more recent range of studies, is to be saying, well, actually, hang on, let's look at this behaviour in a bit more of an objective way. It's not only about getting drunk, but it's actually about going out with friends. It's about catching up. It's about social bonds. It's about the performance of friendship in a public place. And is that bad? You know, is that something that policymakers should try and erode? What's wrong? I can remember one very early presentation I did, some young person saying, do you want to stop people having fun? And the answer is, well, no. And one of the more newer rituals that has come along with going out is hen and stag parties. And that again is a focus of policymakers' concern. The police commissioner in Brighton had one of his policy planks that he was going to clamp down on hen and stag parties as a way of, you know, and that's the reason he should be elected to being police commissioner, because of issues about noise made in hotels, the influence on the street and so on. But again, we would argue that hen parties are also about a performance of friendship, about bonding, and about an intergenerational set of activities. It's not uncommon to find grannies going along on a hen party and enjoying themselves. And this new ritual maybe does have some very positive elements about it. So there are very positive elements involved in the consumption of alcohol. It does include creating more jobs, but of course there are problems with it in terms of health and well-being. And one of the issues is, well, maybe it's not so much of a problem now. We've had a lot of health campaigns. The General Lifestyle Survey has shown that actually we're drinking less. And so that seemed like, you know, oh, maybe we ought to just pack up sticks and go home. You know, it's not a problem. And then some clever researchers at UCL did a piece of research where they looked at how much alcohol was sold and what the duty collected was, and realised that there was a lot of porky pies being told. Self-reporting was not at all accurate, and that in fact there is a worrying concern about excessive consumption, binge drinking, drinking more than 6 units of alcohol, that's 3 small glasses of wine, or 8 units of alcohol, maybe 4 double vodkas, for men in one session. So, health issues, these are health consequences of alcohol consumption. And Newcastle upon Tyne, these are your alcohol area profiles, and you can't, it's a traffic light system. These are health indicators, things like admissions to hospitals, etc., etc. And as you can see, many of the indicators are worse than the English average, and binge drinking at the bottom is right out there at the side. But interestingly, crime is actually about the England average. So crime and disorder is a problem that comes from drinking alcohol. Domestic violence is also associated with alcohol consumption, not much measured. And then there's the issue of crowding out older people from town and city centres at night. And also how you integrate the big night out with other types of activity, the high culture is talking about, and deal with some of the issues of people just being out on the street at night. This is a study we did a long time ago, and we found that the noise levels for a street were very, very high, and they were caused partly by the noise coming from the bars and clubs, but also just from people walking around and talking. And of course, it's almost like ants. This is time-lapse photography, but it does show the kind of congestion that you get. And congestion leads to flashpoints for violence, most often associated around licensed premises. This is a map of Westminster showing these kind of micro-districts where you get many of the kind of violence against the person, and that stands as a proxy for other types of crime and disorder. You also get violence by type of premises, and there's more around nightclubs and discos and less around pubs and restaurants. And again, these figures have been supplied by Westminster. So so you think, right, well, why don't we have more pubs? But this is another problem. The number of pubs is actually in freefall or is declining. It's been a long decline since the beginning of the 19th century. And as you can see from these figures, there's an incredible number of pubs closing every week of the year. They talk about 15 or 16 each week. So why is this happening? It was partly the influence of the pubcos, the big corporations that own pubs. A third of them are owned by two pubcos, Enterprise Inns and Punch Taverns, and they dispose of their estate and sell them for supermarkets or for flats. And it's partly because pubs actually don't make any money, or not very much money, because they can only sell alcohol at high prices. Many publicans find that they're tied into agreements whereby they have to charge a high price for alcohol, and it's actually almost 2.5 times, 3 or 4 times more expensive to buy alcohol in a pub, club or bar than to drink it at home. And the publican actually can get the alcohol cheaper from the cash and carry, but is not allowed to because he's tied into this agreement. So it's very difficult for them to make that kind of business viable. And we found when we were interviewing young adults that they quite often went to pubs for quiet drinks during the week, that it was a place for a sort of more restrained form of drinking, but as we can see, that's becoming more difficult. So not surprisingly, we get pre-drinking or pre-loading, as it's sometimes called. And people drink at home and then go out to clubs and bars. Again, there's a revisionist view of this activity. Some of the medical research has suggested increase with crime and disorder, that this is a practice that should be somehow be discouraged and stopped as much as possible. But in our study, we found that the pre-drinking phase of a night out was very important, that it was a time at which friendships were formed and performed, and bonding happened between networks of friends. Quite often people say, well, we've got this problem with the UK. It's all down to us being Brits. We've just genetically programmed to go out and drink too much. And no, it's not just a British problem. Other countries in Europe have it. Barcelona has it in 2003. They actually suspended giving out new licenses. They've jailed licensees. These problems are not only British. So what have we done about it? We've had the Licensing Act, which deregulated the sale of alcohol in time terms, and because it was prefigured by changes before the Act was put in force, actually it had very, very little impact. And then we've had a series of criminal justice measures, fixed penalty notices, dispersal orders, a whole battery of new offences to control crime and disorder. Newcastle has now introduced a late night levy as of Friday on late night premises across the whole local authority area. I'm sure there's been a lot about it in the press, and I hope there'll be some discussion. I'll be very interested in what you think, what impact you think it will have on the city. So this is the latest policy in the armoury of policy. There's also talk of drunk tanks to be run by private companies for sozzled yobs, as the Sun has put it, and also early morning restriction orders, which haven't come into force yet, which will allow local authorities to designate the very small areas and restrict the sale of alcohol between midnight and 6 a.m. There's softer measures as well, which I think the CEO of Newcastle's talking about now, kind of partnership measures, pub watch, which Newcastle obviously has, Best Bar 1 awards, giving people flip-flops when they come out of clubs so they don't trip on the cobbles and break their ankles, and very interesting policy in the eastern region of the UK, where they have a more benign form of drunk tank, the SOS bus, where young people or anybody who's drunk too much can go and chill out, borrow their bus fare home and so on. So what other measures could we use? Well, in terms of planning and urban design, we found there was evidence that in a broad statistical sense, we draw on other studies that show that where you get clustering of bars and pubs, people tend to drink more and there's more crime associated with them. And this is, the bottom quote is a quote from a couple of our respondents who are talking about when bars are close together, it's very much easier to drink more and not notice about it. And this is, am I allowed to say where it is? Well, this is actually Newcastle, and we say anonymise it in the report. And the red dots are the bars and clubs, and the pink dots are restaurants. And you can see there is a lot of them, and this is a square kilometre of the city centre. And so if you just look at the red dots, you can see there's a lot of places you can go and drink. So what can planning and urban design do? Well, it can sort of spread things out. It can disperse them. It can start choreographing some of that clustering through planning and through meshing together planning and licensing policies. There's also, and you'll probably recognise the top image in the slide, new types of venue. Should they be encouraged where you have a lot of premises together? I mean, that does save, as one of our respondents pointed out, the problem of tripping up on the cobbles because you've got nice, smooth floorscapes. But do we really want the sort of nighttime equivalent of shopping malls? And what happens to those places in the daytime? We can also do things of like reducing the flashpoints and widening pavements, relocating taxi ranks, rephasing traffic lights, trying to influence where fast food outlets are and how they're placed. And this is about crime reduction. There's also partnership working, which is what Purple Flag is about. And it has a benchmarking scheme for places that have met the standard, a bit like Blue Flag accreditation for beaches, for nighttime town and city centres. And the policy envelope covers a sense of well-being? Is it easy to move around from and get away from? And has the appeal broadened? Is it attracting a broader demographic? And how is the place? How is that experienced? And 42 urban centres are now signed up to Purple Flag, but sadly, Newcastle isn't one of them. The Association of Town Centre Managers try to broaden the appeal by encouraging experiments like Light Nights, where they encourage venues and cultural places to stay open all night on particular nights of the year. And this is something that happens in Europe, mainland Europe. But again, my issue with that is about it being very much about a minority experience and not the minority. So to finish, I'd like to sort of move to why do people go out? Maybe we need to sort of go back to first principles and think about, you know, what are people looking for? If we're saying drinking within the home has all these risks associated with it, we want people to go out, we want them to socialise. Why do they do it? And they do it to have a good time. What we found and what Phil Hubbard found in his research was that there's this unpredictability in going outside. It's more fluid, more spontaneous, more a sense of excitement. And yes, we did find much more gusto for a good night out in Newcastle than we did in the southeast. But people are different, and they want different things at different days and times of the week. And sometimes they just want somewhere quiet to sit and talk. And sometimes they want a predictable kind of night with a predictable entertainment like a cinema, and then a drink and a meal. And can you get it? Well, it's difficult. The corporates are taking over. We're getting this problem of concentration. We have this historical focus on retail. So what we found was that people were going to different urban centres throughout the regions we studied for different types of drinking experiences, different types of intensity. We thought that actually, counterintuitively, that was to be encouraged, that maybe there should be more places that are open, and that might reduce some of the problems. And one of my favourite quotes from the research is one of the young people talking about Whitley Bay and loving to go there and saying, I know it's crap, but that's why we like it. So what can be done to broaden the appeal? Well, I'm sorry, we have some legislation. Pubs can be now declared as community assets if there's sufficient community support. Local authorities can delay their demolition or sale. It doesn't exactly solve the problem, but it does help it. And it's not just sort of posh little gentrified pubs like, actually, sorry, I'm terribly rude. That's probably not a gentrified pub in Matven. But trust me, Archway Islington in London is not gentrified. It's one of the grimmest places in North London, and this is a pub that's been saved under this community asset. We've also seen the emergence of micropubs, where people are setting up tiny little pubs in what were shop fronts and selling real ale and that kind of thing. Personally, I find that a bit too male-dominated. It's great for, you know, sort of camera members, but I'm not sure if it's going to broaden the appeal to many women, for example. I don't know, maybe there are more women camera members. But surely this is something to be welcomed. And then we get a completely new, it's not just gentrified places that can enjoy these new types of venues. This is a pop-up bar on top of a disused multi-storey car park in a very deprived area of London called Peckham. And it's been enormously popular. And in fact, some people are saying it's contributing to the regeneration of Peckham. Peckham is the new Shoreditch, but trust me, it's not. And we're getting, you know, new sorts of entrepreneurialism, pop-up cinemas, coming from the recession. This one is in a disused petrol station, and the other, which so sadly closed, is underneath the motorway into London, the Westway. Huge, and that one was successful. And there are other ways of creating mood, atmosphere, excitement through lighting, using lighting schemes in master planning. And there are other ways of attracting people out. Night markets are now being pioneered in London, but I don't see why they shouldn't work anywhere else in the country where there's people who are willing to sell goods and sell them at night. And you don't need much money to go to a market, and you don't need much money to set up a market stall. And hey, that might encourage other types of venues to stay open, such as now Ballan's is one of the first 24-hour coffee places in London. So we've also, with the emergence of mass migration, there's also the possibility of new types of social venues. I'm not sure whether there are any shisha bars up in Newcastle yet, but there's somebody saying, is there one? Oh, yeah, there were. Yes, so this is something new, a new hybrid form of going out, drinking, and being in a public place that doesn't involve high volume alcohol consumption. And there's no reason, and perhaps maybe we could welcome these new types of venue and new types of activity. So I'd like to finish here with asking, how can we, should we encourage people to meet and socialise outside the home, but not drink in a harmful or hazardous way? Should we encourage a greater variety of places to drink and to go out? When we talked to our respondents, they all said they were perfectly happy. But is it because we don't have that variety on offer that we don't know what we could be doing? And one of the issues that Tim and I talked about quite a lot was, where can 16 to 18-year-olds learn to drink responsibly and safely? And then this leads on to the bigger questions about what needs to change. There's been legislative change, there's been policy change, but I'd like to suggest that maybe we actually need more fundamental change to the property market that demands high rents, which then leads to this competition that means that you end up paying a lot for alcohol and for coffee and making all sorts of businesses unviable. Or maybe do we need to change cultural attitudes as well? And finally, a more local issue, where should the 30% of the late night levy, which Newcastle City Council is going to get, where should that be spent? Should it be maybe encouraging a few pop-up bars, pop-up cinemas, some sort of more entrepreneurial activities out in the suburbs? Or should it be solely focused on the city centre? Okay, thank you very much.